This stage in our study of Jonah, we want to do our work in pulling on allusions. As you know, in the book of Jonah, there are some references to other books. One of the easiest ways that I've found to chase down allusions is simply look at the middle column of your Bible. Let me grab mine real quick. A lot of the Bibles that you have will have this like middle column and or something to that effect, and it'll give you a list of allusions. If you're reading on your phone, you might not get this kind of texture, but there's all these footnotes and stuff at the bottom. Just as you know, the Bible is very interconnected. So the people that compiled this translation want to put that stuff at your fingertips. So we're going to pull on a particular allusion that is very informative and interesting because the author quotes verbatim a rather large word-for-word description of God. And we're going to look at why would the author do this. We're now moving from what is the world of the author and what is the culture around Jonah, what is the historical situation, who is Nineveh, asking kind of get a bit of a texture of the world around the text. Now, the last time we focused on what was in the text, we had wordplay, we had characterization, we had verbal patterns that we picked up on and tried to understand how this text is, adds some depth to the story. And now we're focusing on why would the author himself actually quote different parts of Scripture. So we're going to pull back toward the earlier part of the Old Testament in the book of Exodus today. And in the future, we'll be looking as other biblical authors actually pull on Jonah, including in the Gospels, Jesus himself is talking about Jonah. So we're if you can imagine a tapestry and on a wall, and there's a beautiful picture on it. On the back side of the tapestry will be a mess of threads, and you're like, I don't understand. If you just had the back side of the tapestry, you wouldn't think it was very ornate or pretty at all. And it feels like that when we're looking at the Bible. Sometimes it looks like a tangle of unrelated threads, but if we start pulling it, we can kind of piece together. Oh my gosh, there is a really understandable and comprehensive big picture of what God is trying to say. So, what is the author doing here by quoting Exodus? So let's take a look. The allusion, what we're talking about here, and Jonah is the name of God. When Jonah begins giving his reasons as to why he would not want to go, and we finally get a picture into his heart. We know that, we could fill in the blanks a little bit with our cultural context that probably nobody in their right mind would want to willingly go into Nineveh, certainly at this period of time. But we actually have a reason that Jonah does not want to go to Nineveh that he articulates himself in chapter 4. And so we'll just read this real quick. But Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to flee from Tarshish." Now we have the reason. So let's look at it. What is the reason Jonah didn't want to go? "I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." There is something about the character of God that Jonah does not want to be shown to Nineveh, and here it is. So let's take a look. This is a big chunk of text. This a compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, a God who relents from sin and calamity. This is a verbatim allusion to God's kind of pinnacle revelation in the book of Exodus, chapter 34. But we're going to look in the near context. So at this point in time, if you would, read Exodus chapter 19, pause, skim over the Ten Commandments and what ensues after that, then skip ahead to Exodus chapter 32 and read Exodus chapter 32 through 34. And what I'm about to say will make a whole lot more sense when you cover that ground. It should take like 15 minutes or something like that to read all that. So if you would go ahead and do that, um, just click pause and then we'll continue. Okay, interesting illusion, isn't it? Now, what was happening? So God had pulled his people out of slavery, and he had invited them in Exodus chapter 19 to be his people, his treasured possession, and he gave them a way of life. And at the top of that list, what we see in Exodus chapter 20, one of the lists here of the Ten Commandments, no other God before them, right? And then don't make an image of me. Okay, so don't worship another God, don't have an image. So this is kind of key, kind of like God is saying, hey, maybe your neighbors do this, but the way I'm going to be known is not that way. So you got to avoid that kind of worship. All right, got it. So now we're Moses. So Moses goes up the mountain, and he receives from God this kind of covenant way of life, and it's written on these stone tablets. And the people, so as you see this picture here, the multitude, the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt, some say it could have been as many as 2 million people are gathered at the base of Sinai. And Moses is up here in the kind of fiery area talking to God. So while God is up here on the top of the mountain giving Moses this amazing and beautiful way of living, for Israel to be invited into, including plans for a tent for God to actually dwell among his people. So God's like, you could think of this scene as like they're working out the nuptial agreement, right? They're engaged, and they're kind of like, what does our marriage look like? And God is kind of giving them this way of life. So meanwhile, there's a bit of a ruckus at the bottom of the mountain, as you see in chapter 32. And the people are getting a bit impatient with Moses. And they say, hey, Aaron, can you make for us an idol so that we can worship? And they actually accredit it to, they say it's Yahweh. They say these are the gods. It could also be translated as this is the God, right? So this is interesting. What's even more interesting is the fact that this artist's depiction is probably a little bit inaccurate because, as I've mentioned before, calf idols are these Canaanite idols were probably about 5 to 6 inches long. They weren't very big. They were, if you remember Rachel in the book of in the book of Genesis, actually set on her household idols to hide them. I don't think you could do that with something roughly the size of a calf. So probably not life size, but either way, they seem to be maybe. What are their intentions? Is Aaron? We could dive into this. Is Aaron doing this out of he really truly believes that he is kind of leading? They need a cultic image in order for them to lead the worship of God. I don't know. Are they channeling that to Yahweh? Either way, we know that they're breaking some of the key and essential commands that everybody heard God say on Sinai in chapter 20. That you're not supposed to make an image. So, and I know that it sounds a bit odd that they would make a calf. It's actually a bit of a compliment to God. Calves were seen, bull calves were seen as a real compliment. It would have been a symbol of power and virility. So anyway, it might seem a bit odd to us why, if you were going to represent this amazing God that just busted you out of slavery, why would you pick a calf? It actually seems to be a bit of a compliment. But either way, their intentions aside, no matter if this is like kind of ignorant good intentions, ignorant goodwill, and they did want to worship Yahweh, they did it in a way that He said don't do. So just imagine this. I think it's kind of hard to get the emotional freight of what is happening here in terms of a covenant relationship when we think of between God and a people. But if we kind of return to the imagery of marriage, if you would imagine at the moment of you're about to say the I do's, and your wife or your fiance, or husband or whatever, you catch them making out with somebody in the back of the church building. And it's like, wait a minute. Are we serious about this? Because you don't seem like you're exclusive to me. You don't seem like you're here for me. So, as we can imagine, God is very upset. And there's this fantastic and evocative prayer, Moses appeasing God. The Hebrew is a little bit more facial. We've talked a little bit about facial language. As we looked up anger, and anger, and idiomatically in Hebrew, it reads as nose, right? And so even when Moses appeases God, it actually says he softened God's face. So just really evocative. God was saying, hey, you know what? This is what they're doing. So I'm just going to start over with you. I'll still stay true on my promises, and we'll just start over with you. And Moses says, please remember that you brought us. We're yours. This nation we're all yours. Would you relent? And he relents. So let me just pause here for a second. The context in which we're about to see God utter this amazing covenant name is one in which his own people, Israel, have defaulted to idolatry. And it is because God relents from the calamity that he doesn't eliminate all of Israel but Moses and start over with his promise. So I just want that to soak in a bit. Israel had been granted the kind of compassion that Jonah does not want to see Nineveh experience. So Moses comes down the mountain. He breaks the tablets in anger. Again, that's a bit of an overinflated estimation of how big that calf idol would have been. But he breaks the tablets. The Levites rally to him, and people do. There is a 3,000, and if you read this and you're like, oh my gosh, this is terrible, these Levites go and they kill their neighbors, and 3,000 people fall. Interestingly enough, Aaron is left alive, and he becomes the high priest. So I don't know if that's I've often pondered that. Is this the deepest groove of forgiveness you can have? Is someone who led them into idolatry actually becomes the best spokesperson for being the high priest? Maybe he understands God's forgiveness more than anyone else there. Who knows? Because of this episode. But I just want, when we read that and it's challenging, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, the Old Testament just reads so weird. 3,000 people, Well, I do want to think about this. God was saying that he was justified as he was. They had just signed this covenant. They had, if you look in chapter 24 of Exodus, they actually were sprinkled in the blood. This was a seal. They were married. They were wed, and all of a sudden they're with somebody else, if you will. So God would have been justified in ending Israel right then. He didn't. Only 3,000 out of the estimated 2 million people. So is he a God that is compassionate? Is he a God that is just? Yes and yes. There is justice. There is a retribution. There's a punishment, but it is limited. God is, you could say, self-controlled. And he responds to human prayer as he did with Moses. So Moses breaks the tablets. God invites him back up. There's a bit of a new statement of norms, and God and Moses have more of a mediated relationship than does corporate Israel. It's like a tent of meeting. And he invites Moses up early in the morning, bring new tablets, and I'm going to pass in front of you. So if we go now to Exodus chapter 34, now we're approaching the allusion, but now you have a bit more of contextual understanding of maybe the significance of why the author would place in the mouth of Jonah this particular allusion. So in chapter 32, the scene of idolatry, chapter 33, this kind of establishing of the tent of meeting in chapter 34, come back up. We're going to forge some new wedding rings, essentially. They're going to do new stone tablets. These are, again, a sign that God's promise, already within the first generation of people that made this covenant, within the first 40 days, they've broken covenant, and God is compassionate and slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and he forgives them and renews the covenant. So we get a sense very early on that if Israel, or we might even add us as we think about this reflectively, are going to live up to the covenant in which God inspires his people to do, it's going to be on God's righteousness. It's going to be on his steadfast love, on his commitment, and not ours alone. So, all right, so let's read it. Chapter 34, The Lord said to Moses, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first one, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets which you broke. Be ready in the morning, and then come up on Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you, and be seen anywhere on the mountain, not even the flocks or the herds may graze in front of the mountain. So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first one, and went up Sinai very early in the morning, as the Lord had commanded him, and he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hand. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and stood there with him, proclaiming his name, the Lord. Okay, so that would translate Yahweh. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming. So here's his name, guys. If you're wondering what is God's name, here's his really long name. You ready? I'm going to try to say it in one breath. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. And what is Moses' response? Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. He fell face down. Okay, so God passed by and proclaimed his name. And the words after this in chapter 34 is, again, this kind of, I'm making a covenant with you. So after all that, after Israel had sinned, had fallen out of grace with God, had committed an adultery of sorts, God was still ready to wed his people, ready to be in covenant relationship with them. Why? Here he explains himself. This is his character. His character is a merciful and gracious God, slow to anger. That's our idiom there. Eric off long of nose. He has a long temper, right? He's slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Right? That chesed in Hebrew, it's a covenant love and faithfulness. Emet. That is not just. It could be translated sometimes as love and truth, but yes, it's more true fidelity, right? Staying true to your commitments and keeping steadfast love for the thousands. Yes, there is justice, right? He visits iniquity of the fathers to the children and the children of the third and fourth generations, but there's a limited sense of justice there, and a limited sense of judgment. Let me put it that way. That God has a short memory when it comes to sin, right? As we see it demonstrated in this scene. He saw Moses' response. He saw the people's response, and he forgave. Yes, there was a degree of punishment there, but 3,000 out of the 2 million, you get the idea that God could have done would have been justified in doing more. So let me repeat this in case we've missed any of the nuance. The name of God, which upsets Jonah, the character of God, the part of his character that upsets Jonah the most, so much so that he doesn't want to go to Nineveh, is the part in which his own people were forgiven of idolatry. That God's judgment did not come in full. That his justified punishment to Israel did not come about in full. That's the part that Jonah doesn't want to see exercised in Nineveh. So the power of an illusion. We get a bit of Jonah's heart. Let me rephrase it another way. Israel was positioned to be, in a sense, a light to the nations, right? They were supposed to show that this amazing, beautiful God that they had was near them and cared for them and gave them a beautiful way of life, a restored relationship with the human and the divine. And what Jonah's upset about is that God is consistent across borders. That the way he would treat Israel is the way he would respond to Nineveh. So it seems to be that the main factor in Jonah's leaving and disobeying God was not the fear of the Ninevites, though surely that would have made some sense. It was not it was not anything but the idea that God would be forgiving, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, relenting, forgiving. He did not want to see the character of God restore Nineveh. So I think we get a bit of Jonah's heart in this allusion, an understanding that Jonah himself was disappointed with the character of God that would invite even enemies into covenant relationship. And so we begin to understand the author in providing this really evocative allusion, drawing to mind in those who would have heard Jonah would have readily associated this with the scene of idolatry of Israel. So we get a picture of Jonah's heart. His heart is jaded against the character of God because God, in fact, wants relationship with not just Israel, with not just Jonah, but with all humanity. I hope that this exploration has given a sense of the irony of Jonah's heart, uh, to receive the kindness of God and not want to share it, to receive God's character and to be bothered by it because he's consistent with that character to others that we may or may not like. So I think as we'll approach the kind of the last chapter of our studies, how this intersects with us, this is a good segue. Does God's character, what do we do with it? What parts of God's character upset us? For Jonah, it was God's forgiveness, God's slowness to anger, his steadfast love, and how that was inviting even enemies into covenant relationship. What parts of God's character make you upset? So, as we look at Jonah's heart through this allusion, through this reference to a challenging time in Israel's history and God's amazing character on display, probe your own hearts. What part of God's character leaves you feeling a bit like Jonah? So, look and see if you can find any other allusions. We'll be talking soon about New Testament use of Jonah as well, because other authors allude to Jonah. So it's a wonderful tapestry. All right, Godspeed.